Okay, I promised I was not going to start talking about production practices, but now I'm going to start talking about production practices. I'm sure that you've all been to some talk at some point that has talked about the benefits of mob grazing, rotational grazing, high density, animal impact, all that stuff. I firmly, totally believe in using mob grazing. I think it's the only way producers up in the Northeast here, with our smaller acreages compared to out west, can hold enough cattle on our land to make a living on 100% grazing. But there are definitely some warnings to adhere to. High density is a very powerful tool, so it can be used for a lot of good or a lot of bad. I'm now going to tell you about all the mistakes that I made when I started out mob grazing. There are 3 danger zones that I've identified in mob grazing. First one being the remediation of overgrazed pastures, second, the management of time, and third would be the amount of residual forage that you leave. And these are the areas that you have to pay the closest attention to. What do all of these revolve around? Overgrazing. So every one of them can be tied back to that. Overgrazing is not a function of having too many animals on a given piece of ground. What it is a function of is time, and strictly time. It falls into 2 categories. Leaving the herd on your grass too long in one spot, which violates the principle of getting the cattle off before they take a second bite of a regrowing plant, or coming back to that grass too soon, which violates the principle of giving a full recovery time. First one, remediation of an overgrazed pasture. 2 years ago, I signed a management contract on a farm in my hometown that is owned by some people that I've known for a long time, and it had been heavily overgrazed for the past 10 years. I could not wait to start mob grazing this place. I was going to put up some poly wires, start rotating the cows. The grass was just going to come banging back, and it was going to be great. We were going to have more grass than we could ever possibly do anything with. But one thing I didn't realize at that point, I was still pretty new to grazing, is that high density only works when you have ground cover present, because there needs to be something buffering the impact of those hooves on the ground. If you have just open ground, you're going to get what we see in this picture, which is the hoof breaking open the ground, and all you have is mud and a big scar. That's when you get this moss colonizing, and it beats up whatever plants you have left, so it can actually increase plant spacing and kill out grass. So erosion is a fallout from that, because you have this bare ground, rainfall is going to run right off, capping is going to start happening, and you're going to lose all the water that falls down on your farm. Anything that rains down is going to run off, because your ground is going to be so compacted. And the soil is going to be exposed to the sun, it's going to get scorched, it's going to get weathered, and so there's not going to be a whole lot of microbial action going on there. And microbial action is what you need to combat the compaction. And like I said, you're going to accelerate the downfall of your grass stand by just being too hard on it. It's ready in a really fragile state. What it does not need is all kinds of cattle walking all over it. So what I should have done with that pasture was given it rest to start out with. If it's possible, if you're taking on an overgrazed pasture like this and you want to start using high-density grazing, the first thing that you should do is just let it rest. If you can go a whole growing season, go a whole growing season. I know there's a lot of economic concerns and animal feeding concerns that go into this too, but if you don't start on the right foot with your grass from the start, you're going to end up in a really bad place down the road. That's what happened to me. A year into my grazing on this overgrazed place, things started out all right in the spring. We had enough grass, but then throughout the year, we just had less and less and less grass, and I just was damaging the place more and more with animal impact, and all I ended up with was moss and sedges and mud. So let your land rest. After it has had plenty of rest, go about creating ground cover. I would say that, say you sign on a property like this in the spring, let it rest all summer, and then once you get to the fall, you can turn your herd out on it and start grazing off a little bit of that stockpile, not much, and unrolling hay. Unrolling hay is probably the best thing, the quickest way, well, least expensive way I have found to establish ground cover. And so you can unroll hay all fall and all winter, and make sure though that you are not doing this when it's super, super wet outside. Because if you plug up your ground, you're going to be back at square one. You're just going to have a lot of hoof prints and exposed ground. You may need to put your animals in a sacrifice area for the first year or two if you have a lot of bare ground. And when you go on the next coming years, once you have established a litter base and a nice big stand of forage, you may be able to stop using this sacrifice area. But your first operative concern at this point should be not to damage that land any more than it's already damaged. So this is a picture of on my farm where I'm unrolling hay on a pretty badly overgrazed field. This is in the fall. And here's more pictures of hay unrolling that I did in a wooded area that I'm trying to convert to pasture. So there's not any ground cover existing there already. This is what it looks like when the cattle leave it. On the left, just a bunch of hay and a bunch of manure. Here is a spot where I put out a bale the fall before. This was in the spring. So that bale has been there for about 6 months. It was just a spot where I dropped a bale and grazed it where it was, didn't unroll it or anything. So I had a big pile of hay sitting there in the fall. I figured, oh no, I better spread that, otherwise it's going to choke out whatever grass may or may not be there. But I didn't have time before it froze. And so I came back in the spring, and on the left picture there, you can see little pieces of grass sticking up through it, because the seed is germinating in that bale. The bale contains 3 things: seed, fertility, and ground cover. So it's the perfect environment for which to germinate new grass. Then there on the right is that same spot about 3 or 4 months later. That was in the middle of the summer. That is a really nice, effective way to germinate new grass stands without spending a whole ton of money. Let me go back a couple slides. So you have your hay unrolled, and you're putting ground cover down. You're being careful about that. Now say it's the next spring. This is a year after you started working on this property, and you're going to start grazing it in earnest. Make sure that you stock at a very, very low rate to start out. Do some calculations based on how many cattle you think the property can hold, and don't put that many on. Take maybe 5 or 10 animals off of that, because you'll be surprised how much they actually eat. And you may or may not be very accurate in your calculations. I know that I'm not sometimes. So stock at a very, very low rate and graze at very low densities. Just take the tips off these plants. If you leave a little bit too much grass, that's not a big deal right now, because you're trying to put litter down on that grass, and you're trying not to hurt it. So you can always come back and graze that extra grass at the end of the year and stockpile. Just err on the side of leaving too much. Exposure, recovery, and time. I'm going to tell you another story about another property I had, which was the exact opposite. I signed a lease on a property that had not been grazed in about 10 years. So that's what it is in this picture. There's a lot of trees, a lot of shrubs, and the grass was up to my knees. It could actually be argued that this grass was over-rested. And so I figured it would be okay to go really hard on it impact-wise. Which you can do. If you have a lot of ground cover, if you're on a property where there has been sufficient rest, then you can go really hard with the density. It might need some waking up. This is what most people talk about in their mob grazing presentations, about the hoof impact, breaking up the capping, and waking up the microbes, and creating a disturbance, trampling litter, all that stuff. This is what happens in that situation. But don't get too excited about this. You can ruin a property like this really, really easily. You can go from too much grass to too little grass very easily. So don't overstock. Do your calculations again, and adhere to those. Even maybe take a couple head off that again. You can always add more cattle back, but it's a lot harder mentally to convince yourself to destock. And don't get lazy about moving cattle around. You may think, oh man, there's so much grass out here, I can do like a once a week rotation, once every 2 weeks. Don't start going down that road, because the stocking densities that you can use in the east in mob grazing are abnormally high. I have found that, in my calculations, the most beneficial balance of scale and number of animals on your property balanced out with hay needs is 2.5 acres per head. So I found that you can do 2.5 acres per head in mob grazing. But if you were not mob grazing, if you were doing a slower rotation or even a continuous graze, you're going to need closer to 5 to 10 acres per head. And around here, or at least in my area in Buffalo, New York, people only have about 100 acres of pasture tops. So 4 or 5 acres per head means you can have about 20 animals. Now mob grazing, 2.5 acres per head, you can have 50, almost. So don't get lazy, because if you start continuous grazing or leaving your cattle out there too long and you hurt your grass stand, you're only going to be able to support maybe half the number of head you would be able to. And do not allow your second bites. I'll get to that in a second. Yes, sir?
When somebody's overgrazed, conditions obviously it's not going to recover once. You have some experience on, kind of care you're talking about, the take that issue.
in order to remediate a pasture that was overgrazed. Your question was about the time stipulations of that and some things that you can do in the meantime while you're resting it?
Question, how long would it take to restore that pasture?
Okay. The question is, how long will it take to completely restore an overgrazed pasture? I think that depends a lot on how dedicated you are to doing things exactly the right way. I think that if you are to be careful to rest it right when you begin and to deposit ground cover and not overgraze it when you start grazing, 3 years. I think you can be up to almost maximum productivity. But if you start trying to take shortcuts, it could take 5 to 10. Okay, back to what I was saying about allowing second bites and getting lazy about moving cows. The reason you're going to lose carrying capacity if you get lazy about moving cows and you start doing a longer rotation is the recovery period and the regrowth period. So the length of your graze period and the entire rotation must adhere to the physiological regrowth stipulations of that grass. So you turn your herding on day 0 on this chart. You get your cattle paddock and they're allowed to graze that. The grass is bitten off on day 0. The grass just sits there. It doesn't do anything in this area in the northeast until about day 3. On day 3 is when that little grass plant starts saying, I'm going to try again, and it starts to grow again. If, at that point or after, that grass gets bitten off again, it starts to think, is this really worth it? And that's when you start having some overgrazing problems. Now, within that 3-day window, if your animal bites that grass, it must, okay, so your grass is bitten off at day 0. Day 3 is the cutoff point. You can have a rotation 1, 2, 3 days, as long as the cattle are out of there by day 4. So by day 4 is when that grass tries to start growing back, and then from that point on, that grass cannot be bitten off again until you reach full recovery. During that stage is when it's vulnerable. And when you reach full recovery, that's when it's okay to come back around and graze it again. Now, how long does that take? That's something that everybody's going to have to figure out for their own farm. It varies even throughout the year, based on season, based on species, weather conditions, precipitation, even the severity of your graze. But in the Northeast, I've found that the recovery period is normally between 45 days in the spring to about 90 in the midsummer. So a plant is fully recovered when it has grown 3 to 4 mature leaves after being grazed off. So that's when you're able to come back around. Like this chart shows, up to a 3-day graze period is all right, but more than 3 days you run into problems where you're going to negatively impact that plant when you're biting it off until you try to regrow. That's why I say that you should be rotating your cattle every 3 days or less up here in the Northeast. Residual forage. Here's a third consideration. Even if you're doing everything right, even if you've rested your ground when it needs to be rested, you've impacted it when it needs to be impacted, and your rotation timing fits into the requirements that grass has for recovery, you're not quite out of the woods yet. There's one more thing you need to think about, and that's taking off too much top growth. Severe grazing and overgrazing are not the same thing. Severe grazing is taking off a lot of that plant while still allowing proper recovery, whereas overgrazing is not allowing proper recovery. So it could be said that the top growth of a plant and the amount of mass it has above the ground mirrors the amount of mass it has below ground in the root system. So if you're letting that grass grow 6 to 10 inches between grazes, you can be confident that your roots go down 6 to 10 inches below the soil. But if you're chopping that plant off at 1 or 2 inches above the ground every time you graze it, your roots are not going to be a whole lot bigger than that. Every time the grass plant is bitten off, part of that root system dies, and then it has to grow back. Which, if you allow proper recovery, that's fine. That doesn't have a negative impact. But that plant above ground depends on the leaves that you leave behind when you graze in order for it to regrow. So say you leave 6 to 10 inches, or however big your plant is, you leave good residual on top of the ground. That's still enough leaf surface area for that plant to collect solar energy and be able to grow back the mass that you took off. But if you're chopping it off 1 inch above the ground, there's not hardly any leaf matter left there. So that plant is going to have to draw a lot of carbohydrate reserve from its roots in order to grow back. And that's going to take a lot longer. So if you're severe grazing, your recovery period is going to be a lot longer than it would be if you left a lot of residual. So if your rotation is long enough, it fits into your recovery period, but your pastures look like a golf course when you leave them every graze period, you are going to eventually see yourself getting a shorter and shorter rotation. I think that it does negatively impact your plants over time. You're going to have to start moving through your pastures quicker just to keep your animals fed, because there's going to be less forage mass available, eventually you're going to violate that recovery period rule, and it all becomes a vicious downward spiral. You're going to end up overgrazed pretty quick. So, if you think you're taking off too much top growth, the first thing to do is to make your paddocks bigger. This is make a bigger allowance for your cattle every day. I like to use temporary electric fence, the polywire reels and the plastic step-in post for mob grazing, because it does allow you to make small changes like this on a daily basis. Whereas if you have permanent paddocks all set up, then it's really hard to change the size. Your only recourse then is to be able to change the time you spend in them. And with your work schedules and your other farm schedules, everything else that's going on, it may be pretty tough to shorten your graze period by 2 or 3 hours every day. So I think it's a lot easier just to use the electric fence.
Some advocates push tall grazing. They go in once or twice a year. They just flatten it. So obviously the residual is 0 at that point. So do you have experience with that system compared to their more the MIG approach you're talking about?
What I practice on my on my farm is more of a tall grass grazing than an MIG approach. Because I consider, when I'm talking about residual here, I consider residual to be the stuff that does not go into the animal's mouth. The residual can then be trampled as litter. So, yeah, 50% is the rule I like to go by. 50% goes in the animal's mouth, and the rest becomes residual and litter. In the MIG approach, the grass is usually kept a lot shorter, as opposed to the tall grass long rotation. So, my school of thought on it at the moment is that if you're doing tall grass grazing, I think that's great as long as you have the right genetics. That's the school I subscribe to. But you need to make sure that you're not over-resting your grass. That you probably shouldn't have a rotation too much longer than the recovery period, because then you're losing carrying capacity on your farm. You could be using that, you could be going around a little bit quicker and holding more animals. But that needs to be balanced with stockpile considerations too. Because you don't want to make your rotation so short that you're not leaving any stockpile for the non-growing season. Does that answer your question? Okay, almost done here. But yeah, make paddocks bigger. Like I said, I like to use the temporary electric fencing to do that because it allows you so much more flexibility. And if that happens, then all of a sudden you find yourself going around the farm way too fast, though your cattle are full and your residual is proper, then you're going to need to lose some cattle to do that or get another piece of land. That can be a hard thing to wrap your mind around mentally, but you're going to have to do it. Otherwise, you're going to end up going down a bad road. So residual forage left. This picture on the left here, these are both taken on my farm, actually in the same field. On the left there, the paddock that they came out of is the one that they're not standing in. That hardly looks like it's even been grazed, and that's what I shoot for. I always err on the side of leaving too much grass, because I can always come back around and eat that in the next rotation. Even if all it becomes by that point is brown litter, they can still balance out the green growing grass. And in the right picture there, where the cattle are standing, that was before I moved them. I left them there a little bit too long. That still, I mean, it's not too bad, but that's a lot more defoliation than I would have liked to see happen. Because that pasture is going to take a lot longer to come back than the other one, and I'm not going to have as much stockpile left there for the next trip around. So a rule of thumb that I like to stick with is don't take more than 50% of the standing forage in each grazing. And remember to leave enough to stockpile. So review on all of this stuff. How to not mess up your land with mob grazing. Danger Zone 1, remediation of the overgrazed pasture. Make sure that you rest it. The number one thing it needs is rest. If you don't rest it, nothing else you do is going to work. Depositing ground cover, that accelerates the recovery of the grasses that are there, and it puts a buffer between the feet and the soil, so you can't harm the soil surface very much. And start grazing at low densities when you do start. Don't hurt it. Low stocking rate, low stocking density. Number 2, time management. Overgrazing is defined as leaving animals on a piece of grass too long and allowing the grass to start trying to grow back while the animals are still there, or coming back to it in too short a rotation and allowing the animals to get back at it when it has not finished growing back yet. So make sure that you investigate what the recovery period is in your area. You can do an on-farm experiment for that, see how long your grass takes to grow 3 to 4 mature leaves back, or I'm sure the people at your extension office can help you out, or your neighbors down the road. And danger zone number 3, residual forage left. Try to stay away from severe grazing if you can do that at all possible. Like I said in my last presentation, it's probably a better mineral, there's probably a better nutrient balance in your grass to only let the cattle graze the tips, rather than making them go all the way down the plant. You may run into some protein problems there. So do not severe graze, even if your recovery period is long enough. And if your recovery period does become too short, when you make sure that you leave enough residual, you're going to have to lose a couple animals. So that concludes what I have to say today. Any questions about that? Any comments? Discussion? Yes?
I just want to say thank you because I feel like you're a mirror of me and my work in Virginia. But I just wanted to offer something where I've tried with over-grazed pastures and documented actually you can come in and cover the ground and not use the root zone and then actually use animals to stomp the hay in a little bit and then rest it. You can give the determination if you're showing the woods. Depends on severity of the damage and your ability to get that hay out there. I usually use it as part of a hay feeding program so that I'm feeding and only allow the animals to walk and where there's already hay on top so they're not damaging the roots and also being careful of the hugging. What is your thought on that, like covering it and then letting it rest versus the rest and cover somehow?
I agree with that too. And the comment was about how to remediate an overgrazed pasture, doing things in a little bit of a reverse order from what I suggested. Putting down some ground cover in the form of hay, having the animals high density graze that and stomp on it, and then letting it rest. Which I think that'll work equally well too. Just the key there is that you only do that once.
Yeah.
Is that you not continue to do that and then expect the ground to recover while it's being assaulted.
Yeah.
Yes?
With that, rejuvenating the old pastures, would that same thing apply to when you're starting a new pasture?
Yes, the comment was asking, do the principles of remediating an overgrazed pasture apply to new seedings? Yes, they would. I'm not real experienced in seeding, it's something that I've never done, but I do know that if you plant a new seeding, you can't just go to town grazing the heck out of it right away. You've got to give it a chance. So yes, that would be correct.
What types of grass and plants do you have in your pastures?
Stuff that I'm grazing is cool season perennials. It's just the native stuff that grew in the area. Orchard grass, timothy, a little bit of tall fescue, not enough to require any management attention. And mostly stuff like that, and some bird's foot trefoil, and some clover in terms of legumes. Not anything that we have planted.
Do you feel when you leave the 50%, you said it's kind of behind, take 50% off, are you still able to get them to knock down what you want them to knock down? Like even if they don't eat it, like I feel like I have a hard time, like I maybe grading too hard, but I'm trying to get that stuff to actually get onto the ground.
The question was, if you are leaving 50% of the residual forage mass that doesn't go in the animals' mouths, how can you get sufficient trampling? The deal with that is time and density management. So you can stack animals in a very, very high density, but only for a very short time. So you pretty much have to watch them for the first time to figure out how much time you need. Let them walk around, run around, go crazy, but only eat 50%. So as you watch them eat down the plant, you're going to have to move them out when they start getting close to the residual that you want. So you can do very high densities, which accomplish a lot of trampling, but it's going to need to be a very, very short time to allow proper residual.
Move more.
Move them more, yes. Start at the back.
So, in dormant times, can you overgraze?
Sorry, what?
In grass dormancy, can you overgraze? Like if you stockpile and you're strip grading stockpile, grass is not growing, can you overgraze that grass?
The question is, can you overgraze dormant plants during the stockpile grazing season, like if you're strip grazing and stuff? The school of thought and the consensus that I have heard is that you cannot overgraze a dormant plant. You cannot overgraze a plant that is not growing. So you can take it off pretty much down to the ground if you are stockpile grazing during the winter, but be advised that if you are taking all of the ground cover off and you're not leaving that plant anything left, it's going to come back slower in the spring because the temperature extremes are going to have much more of an impact on that plant, whereas the litter can insulate it.
What are you considering mob grazing in terms of animal pounds per acre when you speak about mob grazing?
I don't have a statistic for pounds per acre for mob grazing. I just consider it as a very frequent rotation. So I move my cows every day, every other day. So that's what I consider mob grazing. I think that if you wanted a scientific answer or a line drawn in the sand, I would say that if you're rotating once a week or less, that you're mob grazing, like more frequently than once a week. Sir, do you have another question?
Any comments on grazing economics from local New York on this subject?
I think that there are some areas, the question was grazing economics differences between the Buffalo area that I'm at and down to like Missouri where I worked. I would say that probably the biggest difference is that some parts of New York and probably some parts of this Great Lakes area get a lot of lake effect weather, a lot of lake effect snow in the winter. So that can potentially dump feet and feet and feet of snow on you. So that can be reflected in higher hay costs. Down in Missouri, they can get along with a lot less hay than we can up here. It snows, it gets just as cold, but they just don't have the pileup that we do, and their snow is not as wet. So there are definitely better areas in the country to go, some better than others, in order to stockpile and try to get through the winter with as little hay as you can, and to outwinter animals. But most of the stuff is pretty much the same. I don't see altogether that many management differences or economic planning differences. So the short answer would be that the hay needs would be the only thing.
What's hay cost in
Hay in my area, well, the question is hay cost up in Buffalo in my area in western New York, anywhere between 30 to 35 a bale for 750, 800 pound round bale dry hay. What does it run here?
90 to 120 bucks a ton for very tall, medium quality hay.
Because I've heard that in the other end of the state, eastern New York is about 85, 90 bucks a ton. Yes?
Starting with pretty devastated land like you were talking about, do you see an increase in like plant diversity as opposed to just more and better of the same sets of species?
When it starts growing back? You will see diversity start to explode once you have it back in good health. Because there's a seed bank in the soil of all different kinds of seeds. I think that, I'm trying to remember the statistic, is that 1 square meter of soil, within like the top 6 to 8 inches of soil, there's 40,000 viable seeds in that, of all different kinds of plants and weeds and whatever else that have not been expressed, and they have been beaten down because of the land being mistreated. So when you do start treating it right again and you allow it to return to a more natural state, you'll see a lot of those plants start coming back. This type of thing is very good for bringing back warm season and native grasses in areas that have been improved. You see a lot of that starting happening when you mob graze properly.
What do you do when it gets dumped? All this snow, you have overhangs for your cattle or?
Most people in
areas?
the question is, what do we do with our cattle when we get 7 feet of snow dumped on us? So most people up in my area are still overwintering indoors. There's a lot of confinement dairies, and most people who have beef herds, they're very small herds, and so they do come inside a barn, or they spend the winter out in the sacrifice area, and people drive hay out to them with a tractor, which we all know is the most expensive possible way to run cattle. But there are people up in New York State who are trying to outwinter and are making very good inroads doing it. I'm not sure if any of you have heard of Troy Bishop, the grass whisperer. He is writing a series right now for onpasture.com all about his adventures in stockpiling and outwintering this year. December 6th, I went to a pasture walk on his farm, and he was still on 100% stockpile with his dairy heifers. And he was still going, last I knew, about right around Christmas. So there's a lot you can do in New York if you are not right in the lake effect area. I think that's the only place where you're really going to have a problem and you're really going to need to confine your animals, would be the lake effect spots. Even Jim Garrish said it. He said that the only place in the United States where you probably can't outwinter and stockpile graze all year is the lake effect area. For what?
Outwintering that you were talking about?
Oh, his name is Troy Bishop. Last name is B-I-S-H-O-P-P. You can look up his writing at www.onpasture.com. So he has a very long series on there about how to outwinter cattle in the snowy Northeast. Anything else? Yes, sir?
Yeah, I'm kind of curious about your response to this question over here in terms of the benefits of mob grazing, because if it's just a small amount of cattle on a large amount of land and you're moving them once a week, that's going to be a very different effect than having a big amount of cattle on a small amount of land. So are you thinking about that any more than that? Because just moving them once a week versus not moving them once a week, that does not seem like very impactful.
Well, like I said, there's not really a scientific agreed upon definition of what does and does not constitute mob grazing. But I can tell you that having a small number of cattle that are moved once a week versus a large number of cattle that are moved once a day or something like that, there are a lot of differences in the way that in what the plant experiences. Anytime that a plant say you have a paddock that is exposed to cattle for 7 days, no matter how many cattle you have in it, there are going to be plants that cow prefers more than others. And after about 3 days or so in the Northeast, those plants that they preferred are going to start growing back, and the cattle are going to bite them off again and again and again. So you can actually have a plant that is overgrazed and a plant that is overrested right next to each other. Whereas that doesn't happen so much when you have cattle at high densities that are moved often. You can have a small number of cattle that are still grazed at very high densities. This farm that I was talking about, the overgrazed one that I signed up on, that property had 10 cows on it. And so I just locked them down to probably 1/8 of an acre a day. So just because you have a small number of cows doesn't mean that you can't do high density. You can still accomplish a lot of animal impact with a small number of cows. Does that get any closer to what you're thinking?
Thank you.
I think the crux of the matter is the difference between mob grazing and not mob grazing is the experience of the plant. Yes?
Can I ask when you were talking about you wanted to see more ground cover, before you were going to do some more serious grazing? Are you saying that there wasn't hardly any grass there, or when you looked down through there wasn't a lot of litter there, and therefore you're talking about there wasn't much of a buffer? Can you kind of explain what kind of level of ground cover?
This farm that I was on didn't have a whole lot of anything. Like I said, the cattle had been in one field for all summer for the last 10 years. So the grass was really, really short. Even when it was rested for a while, it didn't put out a whole ton of top growth, and plant spacing was really bad. So there was a lot of exposed ground, and there was not a whole lot of forage mats that could be folded over and trampled onto it.
Could you address the delivery of water, especially in an area that has a fair amount of snow, in particular where the cows actually eat the snow, just process the water?
Okay, question is about water delivery in snowy, cold areas in the winter. That is an area that I'm still learning quite a bit about. That the people say that cattle do eat snow. A lot of the consensus is that performance is really not going to be very high when they do that. So if you are overwintering calves on the cows, or if you're overwintering stockers or growers or milking cattle, I'm not sure if I would make them go entirely on snow. But if you have, say, first trimester bred cows with no calves on them, there could be some merit to that. It could be a big labor saver. But probably the best things I have found so far to keep water open for cattle in the winter, if you are in an area where you have access to electric, would be to use an electric tank heater. Because cattle do drink a lot more when it's warm. Or using one of the circulators I talked about in my first talk. Were you here for that? Yeah, using some kind of apparatus to keep churning the water. Greg in Missouri, it gets really cold down there too, he takes a small tube and pulls a siphon out of his tanks overnight. And so a tiny bit of water trickles out at all times overnight, but that keeps the float valve open. So it keeps circulation happening throughout the tank, and the tanks don't freeze. Okay, other questions? Does anybody here have a tip or a trick that I did not talk about today that they want to share with everybody that can be really helpful? Okay, well, we've done a little bit early today. We have about half an hour of extra, so I'd love to hear from all of you if you have something that you want to discuss from me. And I have business cards on the back table if you want to grab one. I'm always open for questions, comments, concerns. I am a consultant. I help people get set up doing mob grazing, start new enterprises, reorganize their farms, both production-wise and business-wise. So my phone number, email, and website's up there. Feel free to check me out or contact me on any of that. I don't charge for phone calls or emails, so don't worry. And thank you very much for coming and listening to me today. This was my first conference presentation, and I'm very happy with how it went. Enjoy the rest of the conference.
sure if any of you think of any questions or anything, I'm sure you'll be around later on. And just some housekeeping things. I think the next sessions start at 3:30, so before early enough time to go up and do the trade shows. And then do not forget to fill out the yellow evaluation forms. And if anybody has continuing education unit forms, I can help you get those filled out.